Hey guys, so for this video I surveyed players in the Unchained Duelist Facebook group just to gather their thoughts in terms of what they think are the key strengths of the deck, as well as some of the best hand traps and stables that they like to respect as a piloted strategy and much more. So huge thanks to all of you who responded to this survey. I really couldn't have done this video without you, and I look forward to continuing to do this with other meta strategies. Now before we continue, big thanks to my sponsors as usual, links and discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh supplies as well as Yu-Gi-Oh singles down below. Now in terms of the difficulty of this deck, at least how the pilots rated, it averaged around 6.7 for this deck, so pretty wide range though, because someone put 1, which essentially means the deck plays itself, to all the way to 10. Essentially for some comparison, you know, I've had decks like, let's say, Pearly or let's say Manadium that went up to like 7, in the high 7s, and you know, Rescue Ace recently was around 6.6. Of course, it's not the same players ranking this, so you know, it is definitely relative, and not everyone will think in terms of the same, in terms of difficulty level, but all in all, perhaps maybe not the most difficult deck, but with any deck you definitely need a lot of skill to pilot it very well. Now in terms of what tier the pilots would categorize this deck, it was kind of interesting. You know, most like have put it at tier 2, which I think is at the very least tier 2 right now, right? I think it's almost been in a way a surprise to a lot of people how many regional tops it's already had so far. So I think that's really cool to see. Rogue, you know, I think it was obviously Rogue before the new support. I think at this point it's just certainly far beyond Rogue. It's very, very strong. Tier 1, a third of people saying tier 1. I think that's still pretty interesting. And to be honest with you, I don't think it's that far off. I believe it has quite a lot of regional tops so far. And it might get there, it might not, but I don't think it's completely out of the question. So now in terms of the key strengths of this deck, at least I tried my best to summarize what the players said, and the term resiliency came up a lot among all the players, which is really interesting. Essentially, they were saying it in the context that, you know, some of the key hand traps in this current meta right now, which is let's say Droll, Shifter, they don't affect the deck as much. At least it's not nearly as turn ending it would be for like some of the other strategies in the current meta. And also, you know, in terms of like board breakers, like let's say Evenly Match is like a very key one, like, or Dark Ruler, this deck can actually play around it quite well just because of the end board it provides. You know, it's not like some like 10 negate board or anything. It's actually like layered interruptions, which I think is really cool and can recover quite well through something like Evenly Match, which against most of the decks is a complete blowout. And also the floating aspect, essentially, for those of you maybe not familiar with the term because you're rather new, floating essentially, you know, it's kind of like when, you know, a certain card leaves the field and then something else now replaces it. For example, like the Unchained cards, you know, they'll just like special summon another monster, for example. So essentially it continues to have some form of board presence. Its inherent ability to break boards, particularly, you know, going second, obviously this is a deck that's meant to go first, but you know, because of its ability to constantly just pop things away or link things away from your opponent's side of the field as well, I can see why it's one of the key strengths. And obviously, actually, another strength is, you know, its ability to play non-engine cards, you know, hand traps, board breakers, but just its in archetype cards can also board break, so that's always a nice bonus to have as well. And this one probably will not age very well by the time this video comes out. The fact that, you know, the deck is still relatively unknown, I think at this point, kind of this is still partly true, but I think now with all the regional tops, I think people are definitely going to respect it and actually learn the deck and, you know what they do, and hopefully this video also helps with that as well. But you know what, I do get the sentiment of writing this down from the survey's responses. Now in terms of the typical end board that players try to end with Unchained, and again I always try to emphasize this is typical, not ideal end board, just at least some of the basics that you have to know with this deck. And essentially it sort of comes down to, let's say, the Unchained Solar Rage. This essentially quick effect can link away, like, you know, your opponent's monster, so that's definitely an interesting interruption to have. But keep in mind it does target that opponent's monster to link it away, which is definitely something that's going to come up that I'll talk to a little bit later. Essentially, let's say something that cannot be targeted, then you're going to have a kind of a bad time. The DDD Caesar Salad, this one's really nice. It's essentially you can do it twice too, negating a special summon for the most part. So this is also something that they can keep when they get hit with an Evenly, because they have ways to kind of recur, essentially because you have, let's say, the Escape of Unchained, which is a trap that can pop, you know, their own monster Unchained as well as the opponent's card, and then also, you know, let's say you pop the Unchained Soul of Rage. If you have that Yama in the graveyard, then, you know, you can actually kind of revive back that Soul of Rage, and you still have that quick effect link opponent's monster kind of effect available. So those are some of the interactions that you need to know. There are some additions usually, of course, you know, that's like, there's some people mentioned like the Rakia, and also they actually even mentioned the Nightmare Griffin. So that's kind of interesting, I guess. I don't know if that was actually more so like live twin Unchained version or if just regular Unchained also plays it. I mean, also keep in mind that the Unchained Soul Rage, like you're also linking away your opponent's monster, and you could go into something like, I assume, let's say Nightmare Unicorn or something, which is another added interruption actually. So as I mentioned, layered interruptions. Now, in terms of the hand traps that the Unchained players said that they like to respect the most as they, pilot this strategy, essentially you can also see it as, what are some of the good hand traps aside against this strategy. And so first off, you actually have Nibiru by far. They actually mentioned a lot in the comments how it's really hard to play around Nibiru. I mean, they said that they can, but then it just means that you end on a really bad end board, very lackluster, so at that point you probably would lose that way anyways. So that's interesting. Ashe is also another one. They were saying how a well-timed Ashe can definitely like just end turns, can be very susceptible. Shifter is kind of interesting because I briefly mentioned at the beginning how the players actually mentioned how this deck doesn't actually die to Shifter, and some even apparently side Shifter, but at the same time I can kind of see how this happens usually with a deck that let's say doesn't die to Shifter and can play under Shifter, doesn't necessarily mean it plays optimally under Shifter, right? Like, so when you're actually going against the deck that, let's say, plays optimally under Shifter, like Thunder Kashira, then, even decks that can play under Shifter can kind of struggle because your opponent can actually play even better under Shifter. So those are the kind of the instances I can see why people would mention that. Cruel and Bestials kind of go along hand to hand in terms of Graveyard Banishes. The players actually mentioned, the Graveyard Banishing more so hurts like the grind game. It doesn't actually really necessarily interrupts like like the turn 1 board setup, for example. So things to keep in mind. Imperm was a little low. I think it actually kind of depends on the build too. So if you play tour guide package, which from my understanding is a very hot debate in the Unchained duelist group, so I'm not going to get there in terms of the arguments, but if you do play tour guide, then yes, you're obviously going to die hard to something like Imperm or Veiler. You have something like Bell that can come up, and as we mentioned, Droll just does not matter against this strategy, which is a really nice thing to have if you want to pick up Unchained and you don't want to just completely die to Droll, which is going to definitely see a lot of play in this current format, as you would have seen in my regional top cut breakdowns. Next, in terms of board breakers, we have Lava Golem mentioned as number 1, which kind of makes sense, as well as, Kaijus and Kirkar kind of follow along the same lines, but not as good, I guess. Essentially, board wipes that do not cause destruction, of course, as you can imagine, would be very good against Unchained strategy just because they do trigger when they're popped, essentially. Cosmic Cyclone was interesting because they actually talked about how technically this is only good if the Unchained player is going second, whereas, if the Unchained player went first, then Cosmic is not nearly as good because, when they're going second, they're probably going to start off with like set 1 and then try to pop that, and then you can just Cosmic Cyclone it away. Super Poly is also interesting. Let's say something like the DDD Caesar Salad that is a water fiend, and also you have something like Rakia, also water fiend, so you can super poly those away and can play into it. They have some darks as well that they can end on, but of course they do actually have several different attributes, which we'll get to shortly as well. Evenly matched, we kind of briefly touch on. They can essentially just pop their own cards, keep the Caesar Salad, and then bring back the Soul Rage through something like Yama, so that's some good recovery that a lot of decks don't have against an evenly matched. Dark Ruler Droplet, they kind of mentioned about how essentially kind of like that similar interaction I just talked about, dodging evenly. They can kind of do the same thing with those cards, and Lightning Storm, Feather Duster, Raigeki, like again, they just destroy everything. I don't think you want to do that against Unchained. And lastly, in terms of Floodgates, there can be only one was definitely the number 1 mentioned, how it's very, very hard to play around, and it's just, they're all fiends, and they're actually even fiend locked for the most part, so that really hurts. Goes and Match, as I mentioned, they do have several different attributes, so they mentioned it's not nearly as powerful as there can be only one, but definitely can hurt. Summon Limit, I mean, it's okay. They do actually have an archetype spell trap removal, but, again, if they can get to that at least. Zombie World was another one that was briefly mentioned, in terms of, let's say, it kind of stops like the Yama play or even going into the Caesar Salad. And the rest of the Floodgates I don't think is really too huge. They were actually saying that a lot of times they can really play around those other Floodgates. It's just that there can be only one is like the most problematic one. And lastly, I asked, what they felt were some of the key weaknesses of this deck. And so there are several. Now, again, we kind of touched up on this with like something like Lava Golem, just like non-destruction removals, right? They rely on their monsters getting, or their cards rather, just getting popped. So something like Kaiju, Lava Golem definitely can hinder with that. Struggling with indestructible tower monsters. I certainly noticed this because, if I slap on Dragoon, they definitely can have a hard time because not only can it not be destroyed by card effects, you also cannot target it, which Unchained does a lot of both. Now, of course, they do play something like Underworld Goddess to try to get rid of that. So, those are some of the ways to out tower-like monsters if you are playing Unchained. Although, of course, if you're playing Unchained, you would obviously know the deck a lot better than I do. They were also talking about, being dependent on 2-3 card combos, which can always, of course, lead to some consistency issues at times. Now, at the same time, I think they were saying, if you play Tour Guide, then that's more of like a 1-card combo kind of style. But at the same time, then you play into more hand traps, let's say like Imperm or Veiler, which can really, really shut you down in that aspect. And then also they talked about, lack of synergy due to like a lot of the fiend locking Unchained kind of locks you into. And of course, you have something like Live Twin, which is another strategy that I've seen with Unchained. And I've even seen like a small Unchained package in like Labyrinth, although those decks I think are more so Labyrinth than Unchained hybrids. So those are some options, but I can kind of see that, you just cannot really synergize with a lot of different other strategies or engines, for example. And lastly, we sort of touched up on this in the hand trap section, but just kind of like playing heavily into Nibiru and also just like a well-timed Ash. Now, if you watch my regional talk club breakdown, definitely most decks are playing Ash. Nibiru is actually still kind of decently played, but at least that's a card that, you can still suspect a lot of decks will not have in the side or in the main. So you might still be pretty good in terms of, tournament play. But again, it's definitely something that might come up even more once Unchained gets like more tops, for example. So those are some things to keep in mind. Anyways, that was it for the video. Again, a huge thanks to those of you who responded to the survey. It really, really helped in terms of building this video, but also helping me learn Unchained, and I'm sure you've helped a lot of people watching this video learn Unchained as well. So a huge thanks to all of you for watching. A big thanks to my Patreons, as always, for supporting the channel, and well, take care, guys.